Thank you so much, Kathy, and welcome everyone to our event today, hosted by the Electric Power Research Institute and Hydrogen Forward, Scaling Up U.S. Hydrogen, a 360-degree view. We would love to hear from you throughout the event today, as Kathy mentioned. So you can do that via the chat functionality on the right-hand side of your WebEx screen. And I'd love to start off by hearing from all of you attendees on where you're calling in from today. So I'm calling in from Charlotte, North Carolina. I'm here in our EPRI offices and really excited to have this conversation. So as you all know, the world is at a carbon reduction inflection point. Countries and companies around the globe have pledged to achieve unprecedented levels of carbon reduction in the years and decades ahead. Achieving these bold goals will fundamentally require us to transform the way we think about energy, the way we make it, the way we move it, and the way we use it across our entire economy. And that's exactly what we're here to talk about today. How hydrogen and other low carbon fuels may have a role in the United States to help us achieve these bold goals. So over the past year here in the US, we have seen almost every single day some significant, exciting announcement around hydrogen and other low carbon fuels. Some of those have been individual projects, some of those have been through government and other entities. Some of them have been through private and public partnerships that we've seen. So today we're going to have a conversation with some really amazing panelists who are living and breathing this every day on what they see as the opportunity and how some of the impending announcements around funding opportunities and different incentives can help us drive the scale up of hydrogen in the United States. And of course, we need to understand the role technology will play across the entire value chain. And when I say value chain, I'm talking making, moving, storing, using, and of course, integrating hydrogen and other resources into our entire energy economy. So before we get started, let's talk really quickly about some of the opportunities and incentives that are out there at very high level. So I'm sure many of you are aware of kind of the two big funding capabilities or opportunities we have here in the United States. One is the Buildback Better bill, and the other is the infrastructure bill, both of which are essentially a one-in-a-generation type of investment into our clean energy future. So the Buildback Better bill is approximately $1.75 billion overall. It's a budget reconciliation framework, and it's passed the House. It has over $555 billion focused on climate and clean energy technology, and we anticipate seeing significant tax credits and incentives for hydrogens and potentially fuel cell technologies. The infrastructure bill, $1.2 trillion overall, has over $21 billion in clean energy demonstrations, a lot of other opportunities in there, and also over $9 billion focused on hydrogen. And we anticipate that bringing dollars to invest in infrastructure as we move forward, where we're anticipating many of those funding announcements coming out in second quarter of 22. So both of these bills provide exciting opportunities as we transition to the clean energy future. But of course, money alone will not get us there. We need to focus on strategic planning, building on just an extraordinary amount of foresight and innovation. And then we need to focus on what I would call exceptional execution of these types of projects in order to actually achieve this clean energy future that we're imagining going forward. So we're hoping to touch on all of those aspects in our session today. So let's get right into it and allow me to welcome our panelists. First, we have Jay Bartlett, who is a Senior Research Associate from Resources for the Future. Jay?
Neva, thank you. Yes, so Resources for the Future, for those you don't know, we're an independent nonprofit research institution in Washington, D.C., working on environmental and energy economics and policy. My colleague Alan Krupnick and I have been working on hydrogen for the last 2 years. We first started in looking at hydrogen for energy storage, and then broadened our scope to looking at clean hydrogen in industrial feedstock, industrial heat. And most recently, we've really been focused on policy and very specifically the hydrogen production tax credit that we're hoping is included in the Build Back Better bill. So thank you.
Great. So thanks so much, Joe. We're excited to have you here today. Next, we have Tracy Krauss, Director of Government Relations at Cummins. Tracy.
Thank you, Neva, and thanks for having me here today. So I lead energy and environment government relations at Cummins. And for those of you who aren't familiar, Cummins is a manufacturer headquartered in Indiana with over 25,000 employees in the US. We're traditionally known for internal combustion engines that primarily run on diesel and natural gas. But we've been investing in fuel cells and hydrogen for many years with really an increased focus on hydrogen in the past, since about 2018. And that's because we really see it as a key enabler for decarbonization in many of the segments where we operate, these heavy industrial applications, long road trucking. It's really, it's the Swiss Army knife of decarbonizing these hard to abate sectors. So now we've invested in electrolyzer capability for green hydrogen production, hydrogen tanks for storage and transportation, and fuel cells for heavy duty trucks and other equipment. So, and even things like hydrogen internal combustion engines to start really scaling up the hydrogen production, with lower associated costs in the interim years. So really invested throughout that value chain. And I've participated, I'm one of the founders of the Hydrogen Forward Coalition that has us here today and do a lot of other hydrogen work. So thank you so much for having me.
Great, thank you so much, Tracy. Next, we have Lisa Carter, Director of Innovation and Sustainability Technology at Dominion Energy. Lisa.
Hi, welcome everybody. Thank you for the invitation to speak with you all today. I'm Lisa Carter, Director of Innovation and Sustainability Technology at Dominion. Dominion is a large energy company, for those of you who don't know, that employs over 17,000 people in 13 states. We provide energy and natural gas to 7 million customers. And my current role at Dominion, overseeing innovation, I work on all things innovative, which is really fun, from robots to artificial intelligence to nuclear fusion to hydrogen. Dominion is very active in the hydrogen space, with our public pilots so far being about blending of hydrogen into our natural gas distribution system. So I look forward to talking to you today about those two blending projects and from the perspective of an electric utility. So thank you for inviting me.
Of course, thanks so much, Lisa. And then last but certainly not least, we have Adrienne Wilson, Manager of U.S. Policy and Advocacy at Breakthrough Energy. Adrienne.
So much, Neva. It's nice to meet everyone. My name is Adrienne Wilson. I work at Breakthrough Energy, and to just give you some sense of what we do, Breakthrough Energy is a network of organizations spanning investment vehicles, philanthropic programs, policy advocacy, which is what I work on, and other activities, and we're all committed to the unified goal of reaching net zero by 2050 by supporting programs and efforts that fill in the gaps in what we're seeing around the world or a global organization that exists now and what we think needs to exist in order to catalyze some of the technology development that we think needs to happen. Hydrogen definitely fits into that bucket. It's one of those critical technologies that we're seeing as a key piece of getting to net zero by 2050. It's got a diverse array of uses. There are plenty of bottlenecks, though, so that's one of the things I focus on in the policy group. We have several other programs that prioritize clean hydrogen production and use as part of their efforts as well, which I'm happy to go into as it makes sense. But thank you for having me.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Adrienne. Well, so welcome to all of our panelists. We're really excited to have you here. For all of the attendees, please feel free to drop any questions or things you'd like to hear about in the chat. We will be monitoring that and would love to hear from you. But as we get started, I think we'll start with you, Tracy. So, Tracy, we have heard just a ton this year, and we've seen significant kind of leaps and bounds, if you will, particularly focused on things like DOE's Earthshot initiative, the passage of the bipartisan infrastructure bill that I just spoke about. We're expecting and anticipating this creation of at least 4 national hydrogen hubs and or regional hydrogen hubs, and the need for a national hydrogen strategy. So maybe you can walk us through a little bit progress hydrogen has made over this year and where you see the industry advancing in 2022.
Absolutely. Thanks, Neva. And I will say, and I'm sure for most of the folks on here, it has been a tremendous leap for hydrogen this past year. It's almost hard to imagine where we started back in January of 2021, because at that time, the U.S. had no significant overarching hydrogen policy. We were really in the beginning stages of an education campaign, and that's one of the reasons Hydrogen Forward came about, was to say, these are all of the opportunities in hydrogen. And, it's important not just for decarbonization, but for U.S. industrial policy as well. We saw all of the work happening in Europe and East Asia to really get their hydrogen economy started. There were national and regional roadmaps there, billions of dollars of investments. And at that time, the U.S. had none of those things, right? There were a couple of niche bills moving through Congress, and some folks were talking about it at the margins. Of course, not a DOE. They've always been at the forefront, which I'm so grateful for. But we've really been able to advance the conversation over this past year to see not only that national hydrogen strategy being adopted or being, starting off as part of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act that you mentioned. As you mentioned, the Hydrogen Shot Initiative is really one of the biggest programs so far from Department of Energy, aiming to get to $1 kilogram for green hydrogen within 1 decade, which is a pretty incredible goal, and I think they're doing a lot to meet it. And then, as you mentioned, this $8 billion for hydrogen hubs really, to me, is reminiscent of what the EPRI projects in Europe are, where you're just investing tremendous amounts of funding, but really working in a cross-sectoral way to bring together not just hydrogen production, but also users, different aspects of that hydrogen economy, to bring them all together to create sort of these showcases of what hydrogen can do. And what I really appreciate about those is that they're also technology neutral, or rather they are looking at they're looking at hydrogen made with SMR and carbon capture, hydrogen made from renewables. I think there's even hydrogen from nuclear. So really looking at all different aspects where the hydrogen economy can play into sectors that the U.S. has already supported, or sectors that are already active in the U.S. So just looking at where we started this year and where we are now with these tremendous investments and a real vision for where to go is incredibly exciting, and I think really puts the U.S. on the map as being a full player in the hydrogen economy for decades to come.
Absolutely, I would agree with that, Tracy. I'm really excited about some of the learnings certainly we've seen from around the world that has helped inform us as we move forward as well. So maybe I'll shift here to Adria as we think about the big wins we've had here in the U.S. and many will say the Buildback Better Act recently passed by the House. Like I mentioned, adding tax credits or tax incentives for companies that are producing hydrogen, et cetera, is a big win. Others may say it's just a starting point. There's lots of different opinions out there, of course. I'd be curious to get your thoughts on what the private sector could potentially be doing to help accelerate the industry in 2022.
That is a great question. I agree with you. Build Back Better is a wonderful opportunity, and I think everyone has their collective breath held, and we're excited to have it hopefully move through all of Congress and then get signed into law. But as of right now, it's an opportunity that has not materialized yet. I think to answer your question, going back to what Tracy was talking about with the hubs that did pass, the program that passed as part of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, that's a real tangible opportunity to start to develop these public-private partnerships in the U.S. over the next year, as the DOE, which will be managing that opportunity, starts to get more detailed around what that opportunity for funding will look like. There are a lot of details there that have yet to be solidified. And I think there will be a lot of opportunity for input and feedback from stakeholders across the country who stand to play a role in those hubs. For instance, the statute suggests at least 4 hubs for the $8 billion worth of funding for the hubs themselves. But that's just a minimum threshold. So there are questions about what does a hub look like, what pieces of the value chain should be represented. And again, going back to, I guess, the question of what more could be done, is it a starting point? The Buildback Better Act is a starting point because it's great in that it helps to incentivize more supply. It's helping to reduce the cost of hydrogen production, but there are other components to the value chain as well that I think, the transport, the storage, the new use cases, that can all be part of the hubs that are developed over the next year or so. And that could potentially be supported by additional legislation in the future, who knows? And I guess I would also mention, as an example, the Breakthrough Energy Catalyst program is a program that focuses on building public-private partnerships. We'll be working alongside the DOE on demonstration programs and other efforts in hydrogen and a couple of other priority clean technology areas, but hydrogen is one of them. And that work that they're trying to do is provide blended finance to support projects, and also give companies a way of taking the credit that they deserve for investing in innovation. So that's something to definitely keep an eye on if you're in the private sector. So I'll stop there.
Great, thank you, Adrienne. We appreciate those insights. So let's shift now to a bit about the infrastructure bill, right? So we've talked a little bit about Build Back Better, but on the infrastructure side, Jay, this question's for you. So we're anticipating within 6 months, 180 days, right, that the DOE will be directed to establish standards for measuring the carbon intensity of hydrogen production, right? Not just colors, everyone loves their colors, but carbon intensity of hydrogen production. So, and there's been studies, there's lots of studies out there, right? You could find a study on anything, but there's been studies that have been rather critical of creating hydrogen utilizing natural gas with a carbon capture technology. Some of you may call that blue hydrogen or different colors, right? So Jay, how would you reframe that conversation around hydrogen and carbon intensity? How do you think about it? And how do you potentially see, or where do you see a need for standards moving forward with some more specific definitions?
Yeah, I think that's sort of a great question, and sort of for a little bit of background, the infrastructure bill sort of put a minimum of 2 kilograms of CO2 per kilogram of hydrogen for what's produced on site, and that's often what people will think about is, okay, how much CO2 is produced on site in hydrogen production? But ultimately, what we're really interested in is what's the total greenhouse gas emissions footprint on a life cycle basis, which I really think sort of breaks out in 3 parts. And actually that paper that was rather critical, I think actually did us a favor in that it sort of helped clarify, okay, where are emissions potentially coming from and how can we then mitigate those? So of course you have the CO2 that's produced on site. That's an important component. You also have methane leakage, particularly for hydrogen that's produced from natural gas. So how do we sort of mitigate sort of the leakage and from that methane, which is a very potent greenhouse gas. And then the third are all the emissions that are power related. So obviously this relates to any hydrogen that's produced from electricity, but it also relates to hydrogen that's quote unquote blue hydrogen that's produced from natural gas with CCUS, because running the CCUS requires electricity. And if you're just getting that electricity from the grid, well, there's going to be associated emissions from that. So I think sort of breaking breaking those emissions into 3 parts, the CO2 produced on site, methane leakage, and then power related emissions, helps you sort of understand, okay, where are all the emissions coming from? And then what tools do we have to reduce or eliminate each of those emissions in those categories? So I think it's very important to sort of understand sort of the whole sort of greenhouse gas sort of footprint of hydrogen production. And interestingly, that's the perspective that the Build Back Better bill sort of takes. It takes a life cycle greenhouse gas emission standard, which I think ultimately is the right thing to do.
Yeah, I think that's great, Jay. I think looking across the entire greenhouse gas spectrum, not just when you think about hydrogen, but when you think about the entire energy economy, it's really important to characterize and understand how we can best optimize our overall system moving forward. And when I say our overall system, I'm talking big economy-wide energy system beyond any one technology or application. So I think that perspective is really important, and I think we're going to continue to see that perspective embedded into decision-making as we move forward. So talking about decision-making and seeing these things move forward, Lisa, I'm going to shift to you, right? So from a utility perspective, if you will, we're seeing a ton of investment in hydrogen, especially because it brings this long duration energy storage capability, this potential capability to be integrated into grid resources as both primary backup power. So can you tell us a little bit about, from your perspective, how you see opportunities to leverage hydrogen? And then, of course, from the industry a bit broader, what are any concerns you may potentially have?
Yeah, so thank you, Neva. So Dominion Energy is investing in hydrogen and exploring hydrogen because of how it can help us reduce our carbon footprint and help us achieve our goal of net zero emissions. And I think that's the context that's going to make sense for a lot of utilities. And that's because hydrogen is so broad in terms of what it can do. And hydrogen also offers opportunities for us to help our customers decarbonize. It can generate electricity, it can heat homes and buildings, it can power manufacturing, it can fuel transportation, all with low or no emissions. So Dominion's getting started with 2 projects that are, I mentioned earlier, allowing us to blend hydrogen into our natural gas distribution system. That helps lower the carbon footprint of our natural gas distribution system and really explore how to further decarbonize our natural gas business. So our first pilot project, Therm H2, fun name, Therm H2, is underway in our Utah gas distribution business. We blended a 5% hydrogen blend into a test system out there. And then we conducted testing for all the things you have to test for when you integrate hydrogen into your system: appliance safety, pipeline compatibility, leaks. I saw somebody just put something in the chat about leaks, gas quality, and NOx emissions. And in our first test, which we conducted this year out in Utah, we found no red flags, no issues with any of the appliances at the 5% blend. So now we have plans to blend up to 10%. To sort of, move a little bit further on our sort of path to decarbonize our natural gas distribution business. And then we're taking it beyond Utah. So now we have a similar project in the works in North Carolina in our gas distribution business there. So I think what you'll see is companies sort of start on hydrogen, see that it works, and sort of move beyond that. You also asked about cost, and costs are an issue. Costs are important. So far, our 2 publicly announced projects, and I keep saying publicly announced because there's other things coming, but so far our 2 publicly announced projects have been done in the context of our current regulatory framework, which is really helpful in terms of addressing costs. The North Carolina pilot project was approved by the North Carolina Utilities Commission, and the Utah project was using R&D funds that our Utah utility is allowed to use. So as far as addressing costs, we're doing it currently within our regulatory framework, but other options, of course, for utilities, like a sort of partner to work with some of the federal money that's available, some of the money available through the Low Carbon Resources Institute. And before I give it back to Neva, I just want to go back and talk about momentum. You asked Tracy in that first question about the momentum that's really happening for hydrogen, and I just want to talk about that momentum from the perspective of Dominion, which I think is fairly typical for an energy company out there. We've seen tremendous growth just internally in hydrogen and from our customers in hydrogen. Just in the past year, we announced our 2 blending projects. We completed the first stage of one of them. We have a number of other projects that will become public in the coming years. We became an anchor sponsor of the low carbon resource initiatives, $100 million research and development initiative. We created multiple internal teams. We have an executive hydrogen council. So we joined all sorts of organizations, the Southeast Hydrogen Energy Alliance, the National Capital Hydrogen Center. So it's not just globally and sort of in the U.S. It's becoming big and has a lot of momentum within each company. I'm sure Cummins has the same story. Hydrogen is really becoming quite a thing with a lot of momentum. So I'll stop there, but lots going on with hydrogen and lots more to come.
No, that's great, Lisa. And we, you guys have had some fantastic announcements, and we're really excited about your participation in the Low Carbon Resources Initiative, which is jointly led between EPRI and GTI, of course, with over 50 sponsors today being part of that. So, I do want to pull from something that you said at the end and from one of the comments we had here in the chat. So maybe we can pull all the panelists onto the stage real quick as I read something. So this was posted by Benjamin Cross. So Benjamin, thank you for posting this. And it's a quote from President George W. Bush during his State of the Union, January 28th, 2003. And I love this, right? So with a new national commitment, our scientists and engineers will overcome obstacles to taking these hydrogen fuel cell cars from laboratory to showroom. So the first car driven by a child born today could be powered by hydrogen and pollution free. Okay, so I don't know how many 17-year-olds are driving a hydrogen car today. My guess, not many at all. But those born in 2003, I believe, should be able to drive today. So the world is different today, though, than it was in 2003 when President Bush made that announcement. Why do you see different drivers that hydrogen is now top of the conversation again, and do you think it's real this time? Any thoughts from any of you guys?
I can take a quick stab. I think there are two things. And one, I'll say, it was very exciting. And I saw that quote and I thought, absolutely. And I wish we could have found quotes from each subsequent president to that effect. I think in 2003, there was a big focus on domestic energy production. And so that was a real driver of finding these other energy sources that could be utilized domestically, produced domestically, and sort of eliminate some of the foreign policy concerns and even the supply concerns that we had back then. And so now I think, not only do we have the domestic capability of hydrogen to be a domestically available fuel source, but there's also significant more attention on climate change, and the decarbonization elements of hydrogen are certainly important back in 2003, but now that we've seen some of the impacts of climate change and the crisis continues to, move on very minimally abated, the importance of hydrogen for decarbonization, I think, has really increased, and the technology has improved. So I think a lot of us can see, it was a promise then, and now we're starting to see that come to fruition. We're starting to see these systems begin to scale up and begin to really provide those benefits, especially in Europe and East Asia, where they had a little bit of a head start. I look forward to seeing that here in the US too. And at Cummins too, I'd say, maybe in 2003, there was a real focus on fuel cells or the utilization of the fuel. And now I think there's a ton of focus too on the clean hydrogen production. I mean, renewables are in such a different place than they were in 2003. I think that story is also contributing to why we're seeing this hydrogen renaissance, if you will.
This is Lisa. I'll just pick up on that. I think it's a number of things, but one thing I'll agree with Tracy on is it's definitely the focus on decarbonization is much bigger than it was in 2003. But then a near-term thing that I think has been important is this whole discussion of excess renewables and the ability to use excess renewables and use hydrogen as storage. And that's a newer thing that I think is driving hydrogen. But it's the momentum around decarbonization, I think, is by far the biggest driver.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And to sort of add on to that, I think sort of now looking at sort of decarbonization economy wide, okay, we're doing well in the power sector. We sort of we think that'll sort of continue. We have movement in the transportation sector. What about some of these other areas? And obviously the industrial sector is a particularly difficult one to decarbonize. And that's, one obvious area where hydrogen can play a major role.
To chime in, so much good stuff has already been said. I would just agree with the need to have that additional piece in our energy sector. If we're able to electrify things with electrons directly, that's great. But hydrogen, with my nerd glasses on as a scientist, is a flexible energy carrier, right? So you convert electrons into chemicals as a fuel or a feedstock through hydrogen as the starting place for that. At least with electrolysis, you could do that. And there are other ways too, right? It's a conversion medium, which I think gives it a lot of flexibility and potential, filling the gaps that we need to drive down emissions over the next couple of decades.
Absolutely, Adrienne. There's been a lot of questions in the chat that tie to this a little bit, right? When you think about even system efficiency, there's a question in the chat around, hydrogen, creating hydrogen to then use it to burn to create electricity, and is the efficiency there? So, I think at the end of the day, there's not a one-size-fits-all solution. We need to have as many technology options on the table as we possibly can. And the implementation of those options based on where you are in a region, based on your industry, your natural resources, et cetera, may be very different. So driving all those technologies as far as we possibly can, meaning make them as scalable, as affordable, as reliable as we can help us achieve an optimized energy system across the U.S. here. And we've talked a lot about decarbonization, but we need to make sure our energy system of the future is not just low carbon, but it is affordable, it is reliable, and it is resilient. And we can't give those things up for our energy future. So with that, let's get back into to individual questions here a little bit. Keep dropping them in the chat though, because we will pick them up. There's been some great questions. I'm not sure if we'll hit all of the technical ones, but we'll certainly at least try to touch on them a little bit. There was a question earlier, I think it went only privately to me, but it talks about the significant investment we're seeing here in the U.S. and it talks about, the investment we're seeing around the world and how many other countries already have defined or embraced a national hydrogen strategy. So Tracy, maybe from your perspective, can you give us some thought on why is developing a national hydrogen strategy as it has that in the bipartisan infrastructure bill such a critical step in embracing kind of our national pathway in this direction?
Thanks, Neva. And that is absolutely, a national hydrogen strategy is the key, I think, to really unlocking the potential in any given regional economy for hydrogen. And that's because it points us all in the same direction. So speaking from Cummins, we're a global company. We're headquartered in the US. Most of our employees are in the US, but we operate everywhere. And some of our earliest investments in the hydrogen ecosystem, right, have been in Europe. And that's because we've seen those that EU-wide and those regional hydrogen strategies, because it allowed us to invest where we knew the economy was going. So we were able to partner with Alstom in Germany on their hydrogen fuel cell powered passenger trains, which are carrying passengers today. We've invested in electrolyzer manufacturing in Spain because they had the right carbon tax framework and green ammonia incentives to really make a project there pencil out. And those were all possible because those regions had national hydrogen or national and regional hydrogen strategies that gave specific targets that the government and industry could work towards together. And so I think with the US implementing or developing and then implementing a national strategy, it will get industry, government, and also, academia and all other stakeholders on the same page on what the art of the possible is, and then working together on how to actually achieve those goals. And it gives us a little bit of visibility on how and where to invest in a way that, we know even in a change of administration or change of Congress or things like that, that, some of these goals will remain constant and embraced by departments of energy, EPA, DOT. It also, just one final note on it, really marshals the resources of all of those agencies. DOE has been looking at hydrogen and fuel cells for decades, but to get Department of Commerce involved in clean exports, to get Department of Transportation involved in hydrogen fueling stations on clean corridors, right? These are all elements that need to come together in a coordinated way to really support this economy. And I think that the national strategy will help get all of those agencies on the same page, along with industry, along with other stakeholders.
Absolutely, Tracy. You talk about, beyond Department of Energy, you have the Department of Transportation, Department of Commerce, and many people are looking at some of this pending funding to be opportunities to really ensure we have an equitable transition, an equitable growth across the board. So, but with that being said, when you think about all the different parts of the economy, there's not that one-size-fits-all solution or one resource-fits-all solution. So, Jay, maybe you can give us some perspective. When we think about geographic diversity here in the United States, the idea that natural gas is abundant in certain areas, you have wind and solar in others, nuclear maybe in others. How are you thinking about implementation of hydrogen hubs and utilizing different natural resources in different locations and coupling those with the equivalent or with the right economic place there to enable some of that development as we move forward?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that sort of brings in a lot of what people have touched on sort of, in our comments and what I've seen in the chat box, is that, sort of to have a hub, you need sort of a number of ingredients. You need sort of the energy sources, sort of what you mentioned that lead to that hydrogen supply, whether that's, hydrogen from electricity that's renewable or nuclear, or hydrogen from natural gas. So you have sort of that side of it. And then you also have the pipeline infrastructure. So hydrogen pipelines, really just sort of a Gulf Coast sort of, phenomenon today, but obviously that needs to be expanded elsewhere. Salt cavern storage, which is the cheapest way to store hydrogen sort of long term. And then finally, hydrogen demand. What are sort of, what's the ultimate use for it? Is it sort of in industrials where it's almost exclusively used today in oil refining, ammonia production? So all those sort of four ingredients, sort of the supply, the pipelines, the storage, and the use have to sort of come together. And I think that's what sort of, what makes a hub a hub. I think also you could kind of say the Gulf Coast already has a hydrogen hub today. It's just not yet a clean hydrogen hub. So I think they definitely have sort of a first mover, already having some of this infrastructure in place, and certainly having a demand in place. And when you think of sort of all of the sort of the oil refining and petrochemicals that are sort of in that sort of region. So that's sort of a very obvious sort of one to kind of start with. But I've been impressed. You've seen sort of other, even prior to sort of this infrastructure bill and the DOE work, you've had folks out in Utah that said, well, we have sort of, cheap renewables and salt cavern storage, and we've sit in a great place where, we can use that for energy storage. So you've seen those sort of hub ideas sort of percolate elsewhere where you have those sort of natural advantages and sort of all coexist.
Absolutely. Great, Jim. You said a lot of things there that I'd like to pull from, but the first thing you talked about was hydrogen today. And I think that is a concept that not everyone has their head wrapped around. So we use a lot of hydrogen in the economy today, right? And when you use that hydrogen, you do not emit CO2, right? So people think hydrogen low carbon. However, hydrogen today is what I call a high carbon energy carrier, because almost all of it is created from a carbon intensive process without CO2 mitigation. So when we think about the hydrogen for tomorrow, we have to think about how do we create that hydrogen in a way that is now a low carbon energy carrier. So when we use it, again, it's not emitting CO2, but it's also not emitting CO2 in that value chain along the way. So I think, you bring up that point, but I think it's an important point as we think about how it integrates into our energy system tomorrow. The other thing you brought up is you talked a lot about renewables and coupling hydrogen with renewable assets. So Lisa, maybe you can give us some perspective on this, really around reliability and resiliency of our energy system. So grid resiliency is going to continue to become a bigger and bigger topic. I think this last year, we've seen it highlighted particularly with the events that happened in Texas that had a very large impact, not just in Texas, but in much of our electric grid. And then, we see blackouts in other places in the country as well, certainly through peaking months. So as we see our energy providers pivot more towards renewable assets, how do we see the role for hydrogen helping us potentially address some of this need for maybe firm capacity or reliable and resilient energy systems as we move forward?
And Neva, I'll be happy to address that. But before I do, I want to talk just about some of the things in the chat about pipeline integrity, NOx emissions, flanges. I'm not sure I know what a flange is, but I know what they do. That is exactly why we're doing our pilots, right? It's to figure out what happens when you blend natural gas into your pipeline system. What happens to your NOx emissions, to your flanges, to your leakage, to your pipeline integrity. That's exactly why we're doing those tests. So hopefully that addresses some of the questions in the chat. So back to your original question. So I'm glad you asked it because, resiliency, especially after what happened in Texas, is a really hot topic now. And hydrogen addresses resiliency because it adds one more tool to our toolbox as we try to decarbonize. Solar is great, wind is great, offshore wind is great, nuclear are great. They're all great carbon-free fuels, but isn't it nice to have another option, right, to make sure you've got a sort of diverse toolbox? So let's just take my company and think about all the ways we can use hydrogen. We can blend it in our natural gas distribution system to reduce the carbon footprint of our gas distribution system. We can blend it with natural gas in our power plant to reduce their carbon footprint. We can use hydrogen as a clean transportation fuel for our vehicles or our customers' vehicles. We can use it to store energy, and I think this gets back, Neva, to some of your resiliency questions. We can use it to store energy from wind, from solar, from nuclear, from offshore wind, to be used when the hydrogen is needed. And those are just the uses for, my industry. We've already talked about the uses for manufacturing. So we definitely see hydrogen as one more tool to address resiliency across the U.S. It just gives us another way to address it in ways that we need. We need a very resilient energy system. So I hope that answers your question.
It absolutely does, Lisa. Do any other panelists have thoughts on resiliency that they'd like to share? I know this is really a big topic that's top of mind for many. Okay, Adrienne, maybe I'll pull a string that I started going down a little bit, which was around how we currently produce hydrogen today, right? So in the U.S., 10 million metric tons. It's far from being an early industry, right? We know how to do parts of this for sure. We know how to do it well. We know how to do it safely. So can you explain to us what you think is needed to address emissions from the current production methods and how we can drive down the carbon intensity of hydrogen or make it a low carbon energy carrier, and how these technologies can integrate and work together?
Sure. Yeah. So I think during this question, the best place to start is to, again, bring up the entire value chain. And you have these different pieces. You have the input, the hydrogen production, and then it's going somewhere, or maybe not going very far at all, but it's going to be used somewhere else. We have today, I think it's 10 million metric tons, you said, of hydrogen that's already being used. You need it to synthesize chemicals. You need it in ammonia production, as people in the chat have pointed to. I think Jay mentioned petrochemical development. It's a necessary building block. The irony here is that, we're all made, if we're getting a little philosophical, we all have tons of hydrogen in our molecules that comprise us, that comprise everything around us. It's just not found, for the most part, in its molecular gaseous form for us to harvest in that way. So we have to make it, right? And so I think most hydrogen today is produced through steam methane reforming. The best thing to do is to reduce those emissions as quickly as possible. And frankly, blue hydrogen is steam methane reforming with carbon capture on it. So that maybe represents the most cost-effective way of bringing those costs or the cost of the emissions down, so the greenhouse gases from that process down. But there are other things you can do to decarbonize those plants depending on how old they are. You could replace them with a newer technology, whether it's out of thermal reforming or potentially electrolysis, but it might just make sense to cap it. All of that being, like, I'm not read up on like what's right for each plant. I think it again has to do with regional resources, interests, what works for whoever owns that plant. But we also talked about this, over the next 30 years, we have to get to a place where we have at least 10 times more hydrogen available in general to do the things it's currently doing and to do the new things we're hoping it can do to help us get to net zero, which means we need a lot more. And I think somebody pointed to this in the chat as well. That means a lot, like even more renewable electricity production than we would need otherwise to electrify. And it also means we need other resources because electrolysis produced hydrogen is probably not going to be at scale for 10 years. So I think generally speaking, there's a lot of room for innovative production pathways and the ones we know that are a little bit more mature that work today. So that's everything from new innovative ways of doing electrolysis and potentially like integrating that with like the fuel cell, depending on the application, to something like methane pyrolysis or maybe even bioenergy production of hydrogen. Who knows? I think there needs to be space for innovation, but we need the resources to catalyze the development of those innovative pathways, the newer ones, while also putting into place on existing production a way to cap it, a way to displace the emissions now.
Great, thanks, Adrienne. So, Adrienne, you talked a little bit about timing. I think you said electrolytic hydrogen about 10 years or so. What do others think here about timing? When do you see, potentially see these technologies not just being demonstrated, because they're being demonstrated today, right? Some of them are fully scaled today, some of them are being demonstrated today, but when do you see them scaling and having this broader economy-wide impact? What timelines do you guys have in your head?
I can start on that one. I think there are potential opportunities to make real carbon reductions today, and that's using some of the technologies that already exist paired with some of the newer things. So I'm thinking of, certainly we are doing electrolysis to produce green hydrogen today. And as that scales up, which I think that will in a sooner time frame necessarily than fuel cells for transportation, right? So as the green hydrogen economy is really scaling up, we can take advantage of that. In some cases, we're hearing customers saying, I will have more hydrogen than I know what to do with. So something like a hydrogen internal combustion engine or an ICE that's running on this zero carbon hydrogen can be really effective in significantly reducing carbon emissions vis-a-vis what would typically be a diesel powered vehicle, utilizing that green hydrogen, thus, creating the scale up effect and increasing supply and reducing cost of the green hydrogen. And then also getting customers like fleets really comfortable with the idea of running on hydrogen, so that as fuel cells become more cost competitive, maybe in the 10 to 15 year time frame, you already have that transportation framework ready and you already have users comfortable with using the fuel. So I think, some elements, I'm thinking of fuel cells for long haul transportation or for other heavy industrial applications, might still be a decade or more out, that we can be using some of the resources that are available sooner, like green hydrogen from electrolysis, and to Neva's point, even blue hydrogen. We can use those today to reduce emissions today, while additional technologies are scaled up, costs come down, efficiencies go up, all the things that need to happen to really make them effective and used in the economy beyond just the demonstration phase.
Yeah, one of the things I think is sort of a great kind of point in there is that, and I think sort of it's a good sort of contrast when we look at, the development of wind and solar. They were producing electricity that could just be sort of utilized in the grid. Here we have something that, at least we have some demand for it, sort of, what Adrienne was just talking about. But to sort of go beyond that, it's not just sort of a drop-in fuel. You need sort of to develop, whether it's a new engine, whether it's, sort of, it sort of requires some modification, certainly requires modifications, to sort of do, pure hydrogen sort of transport via pipelines. So I think you have a different kind of scenario when we sort of contrast it to other things that have sort of taken off recently, sort of wind and solar in the power sector. You don't have that kind of immediate sort of drop in demand. And also on the policy space here, we don't have, hopefully we have a production tax credit if that happens in Build Back Better. But we sort of know with wind and solar, not only did they have incentives on the production side, they had the incentives on the demand side through renewable portfolio standards. We don't really have that with hydrogen. So we have kind of barriers, both sort of policy and technological, that quite distinguish hydrogen from sort of our earlier success stories.
Great, thanks, Jay. Any other thoughts on timing pieces? Okay, so there's some great questions in the chat here. Again, I don't think we're going to have time to cover all of it. There's a question there around concerns about water availability for hydrogen production, both from feedstock and cooling perspective. I certainly have some perspective on that from the EPRI side of the house, from kind of the technical piece, but I'll open it up for this group first. But, what are concerns around water, but not just water, maybe other natural resources or environmental impacts? Right, when we think, and there was a question earlier about really taking a holistic approach to this new energy economy, and what are things we need to be considering? Any thoughts on that piece?
Really quickly and say, I think that's keeping as much of a holistic frame of mind as we can as we move forward with hydrogen is a key piece, because if decarbonization is the goal, there are a lot of other things we've already talked about as well that we need to also keep balanced and moving forward. All of the balls need to stay in the air, whether it's resiliency, reliability, trying not to create more like co-pollutants and environmental degradation, I think also needs to be on the table and you can start to see why this is complicated, why we need a national strategy, why we need people thinking about this, and why we need stakeholder feedback, right? So I think it's definitely, water availability is another one of those things. It's an example of an environmental concern. We need to make sure as we innovate and drive forward, we're not, to the best of our ability, creating more problems for ourselves.
Absolutely, Adrienne. I think that holistic look is really important, the whole idea of not creating more problems. That being said, every technology has a footprint. They're all different footprints. They all touch different aspects, but we need to understand those footprints and design ahead of those footprints as much as we can to be very intentional in our outcomes down the road. Okay, I know we only have a couple minutes left, so I'm going to steal a quote that Adrienne used in the beginning here, and she was talking about everybody has a collective breath held, right? Everybody's holding their breath for something. Some of it's for the money that may get approved. Some of it is for other things. So I'd love to hear from you guys each, maybe 30 seconds or so each. What are you collectively holding your breath for? Or what are you most excited about over the next decade? And through some of the opportunities that are coming out there, through some of the demonstrations that have been announced, through some of the innovation that's happening in this space that can impact our overall energy economy in the next couple of decades.
Yeah, I would say I'm holding my breath on Build Back Better in the sense that having sort of a production tax credit, at least sort of for widespread sort of scale up of clean hydrogen, I think at this point needs to be sort of, is a necessary ingredient. Then we'll have other things that are also necessary, but I think it has to start there.
Yeah, this is Lisa. I am very excited to start to see hydrogen demonstrated for real at live facilities beyond pilots. And we're getting there fast and furious in the U.S. And Europe's a little bit ahead of us, but I think we're making tremendous projects. You see announcements every day. Something came across my desk this morning about electrolysis on offshore wind turbines. So, I think that I want to see hydrogen useful across all the sectors, and I think we're very close to that. And I'm excited about what we're doing to make that happen.
So I'll go, the thing that I'm holding my breath for, and I might be holding it for a little bit, but it's an economy-wide price of carbon, because I think that is truly create the right framework to really, allow us to think of those whole energy systems and to put the full power of all of the stakeholders behind getting to zero. I think, that would go a long way for renewable hydrogen, but also some of the transmission and distribution issues in the grid we talked about. Really that economy-wide look at getting all the right technologies working together. So price on carbon, that's the key.
I feel like those are all really good ones, and I also will hold my breath with the other panelists on each of those things. I think I'm echoing, that it's the innovation piece in general, the support for using hydrogen in those new demand cases to make clean steel or, replace the heat required in developing cement. That will be really exciting. It might require more policy support, but as Jay was mentioning earlier on in our conversation, Buildback Better, it's the production piece. We do need to incentivize the step change in the market to using altered processes, new pieces of equipment to integrate clean hydrogen in a way that will ultimately become cost competitive, but they need help over the activation energy barrier there. So starting to see things get deployed in the next 5 to 10 years will be really exciting.
Absolutely. Well, I think those four answers really actually go well together, and I'm going to add a fifth to that. So we heard for Jay, Buildback Better. I'm gonna bucket that as money and financing. We heard from Lisa, hydrogen demonstrations for real and seeing the real results in the ground. Tracy, keeping that economy-wide perspective. Adrienne talking about the need for innovation. I'm going to add the need for collaboration. And I think with those 5 key things, those ingredients can really help us achieve the bold goals that we talked about at the very start of this session. So we are a minute over. I want to give a huge shout out and thank you to our panelists. You guys are all amazing, really fantastic perspective. We will be following up with many of the comments that are made in here. We'll save our chat, and the session is recorded if we do want to share it more broadly, of course. So thank you all for participating today. Hope you have a fantastic rest of your week and a great holiday season. 2022 is going to be a great year. Thank you all so much for attending.